So one of the handouts, there were essentially three of them, right, that you have out there. The one is the root text that's translated by Ziggy. Ziggy was a student in the master's program with me, and she did a wonderful job translating it. She based it on Stephen Batchelor's to some degree. It varies in very certain places. Certainly in chapter 9, it goes to verse, whereas Stephen Batchelor decided to abandon verse and do it more like just prose kind of thing. And then the second one was a commentary that was translated by Venerable Fedor, who many of you know, who's taught here before. He translated Gyaltsabje's commentary. Gyaltsabje is one of the heart disciples of Lama Tsongkhapa. And so it's a nice commentary. It's a little succinct. When I taught this in 2006, we didn't have that commentary available. So I haven't taught from that commentary, but I've gone and compared it to the commentary that I used. And in the third handout, the third thing that's on there, the file, are actually some quotes sometimes from that commentary, because that's what I had prepared back in 2006. I didn't have a chance to go through and review a lot of this that's in your in that file. It's called For the Highest Good, Part 1. It gives some additional information on various things that I'm going to be discussing. So that would be the main one to have in terms of referring to here and there throughout this weekend, and particularly for today when I'm going to go into some of the introduction to this topic. But this is going to happen with my sweater. It's not really clipping on so well, but okay, I think that's better. All right. Yes, Richard.
Don, you're doing the first three chapters this weekend?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. And are you then coming back, or are we going to find out how it ends?
There are plans for me to return. Yes. Yeah. The problem is, of course, again, that I'm teaching for 6 months now. After I leave here, I go back to Santa Fe, and I'm there until May when I start going back on the road again. So we're also going to be discussing the possibility, I don't know whether it'll happen or not, of doing a remote teaching on parts of this as well, since it's hard to kind of fit it all into my teaching away schedule and what have you. And I don't know, but we haven't talked through all the plans. We're going to do that this weekend while I'm here, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Great.
All right. Yeah, it's certainly my hope that I can continue to teach this, and we'll finish this text. So let me go ahead and introduce the subject. If there are any other questions? Okay. So again, I mentioned in the meditation that really the whole heart of this text is bodhicitta and the practices of a bodhisattva. The text is called Bodhicaryāvatāra. Usually it's shortened to Bodhisattvacaryāvatāra. It essentially is translated sometimes, and I think for the basic program they translate it as engaging in the bodhisattva's deeds. But sometimes you'll see it as the way of the bodhisattva, or the guide to the bodhisattva's way of life is what it was originally published by Stephen Batchelor as. Different ways of translating this title. But essentially what we're going to be looking at in this course in particular, in these first 3 chapters, is the mind of bodhicitta, how we go about developing it, strengthening it to some degree by eventually taking the bodhisattva vows. Probably some people in the room who haven't taken the bodhisattva vows yet, and it's perfectly fine. But we'll give a little bit of very brief commentary on that. I have done more extensive commentary on the vows. If anyone is interested in listening to that, I can give some direction as to how to retrieve those teachings. But it is good to study those vows if you have the opportunity to in advance. So this is, because of all the subject matter, as I mentioned in the meditation, this is a Mahayana text. This is one of the core Mahayana texts. It's one of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's favorite texts. He studied it with this amazing Lama known as Kunu Lama Rinpoche, who many of you have heard of, who wrote a kind of verses in praise of bodhicitta. I don't know how many verses they are, over 100, I think, of verses praising bodhicitta. Apparently he was quite renowned for having developed his own practice of bodhicitta. So what I'd like to do is first introduce a little bit about this subject of bodhicitta. We'll talk in a few minutes about Master Shantideva. But if you have that handout there, which is essentially this one that is the third I mentioned, For the Highest Good, Part 1, the handouts. There's a definition that is given in Maitreya's text, Abhisamayalankara, that we studied in the master's program. And essentially the definition of, it's called their mind generation, but it's the mind of bodhicitta that we generate, that we have as the core of our practice. This mind of bodhicitta is called the desire for complete enlightenment for the benefit of others. So we have kind of these two aspirations that are mentioned on that same page in item B. The conventional mind generation is what we're talking about, as opposed to ultimate bodhicitta or ultimate mind generation. We'll talk about that later. It's composed of two aspirations or desires. The first is the aspiration to benefit sentient beings, and this is what Rinpoche always emphasizes the most important. And this is what gives it all the juice, is that it's the aim of benefiting all sentient beings without exception. But what we recognize is that we need to obviously become more qualified in order to do that. I think I used this the last time I was here when we talked about bodhicitta, the example of a young girl. Say a young girl has a lot of people in her family who have cancer, and she gets moved to want to do something to help people with cancer. But obviously when she's 6, 7 years old, she doesn't have the capacity to help people with cancer. She needs to go through all of her schooling, go to medical school, become an oncologist or a cancer researcher or whatever, and eventually she can help people with cancer. Well, it's the same for us. If we really want to help sentient beings to the degree that they need help, well, then we have to become better qualified. And the way for us to become better qualified is to become a Buddha. So as it says there in that item B, the first aspiration is the main cause, the desire to benefit sentient beings. But the second aspiration is its companion, is what needs to come along in order to accomplish that cause. Most of you have seen teachings on bodhicitta before, so I'm not going to go through in great detail everything that's on this in this section, because while this subject comes up frequently, in this text, most of the instruction on achieving bodhicitta is just through the Lam Rim. In the middle length Lam Rim, there's extensive instruction on how to do that. So there are two types of mind generation. We can talk about two types in one way, two types in another way. But let's talk about the two that are mentioned here. And these have to do with whether we just call it simply aspirational or wishing, or whether we call it engaging. So these are both defined here once more from that same commentary on Maitreya's text that I'm citing a lot of this from in this first handout. The wishing mind generation, the bodhicitta of aspiration, is described as an aspiration that wishes to become an enlightened being in order to benefit other sentient beings. So it's what we're talking about mostly this weekend, right? Is the beginning point, which is we have to aspire for that goal. If you don't have the aspirational bodhicitta, you can't go on to develop the second one, which will come in more when we get into the later chapters of the text, where we get into how the bodhisattva actually engages in actions on the basis of bodhicitta. So it's called engaging mind generation, or engaging bodhicitta of action. It's described as a mind that engages in the multitude of actions beginning from the moment of taking the engaging vow. So the bodhisattva vow does become the delineation then as to whether one has engaging bodhicitta or not. But for most of us in the room, we still don't even have a fully uncontrived bodhicitta. We're still kind of working on developing bodhicitta. So even though we take our vows, that we can't say that they're maybe fully qualified, but they're still the vows. We still are taking those vows. We don't yet have the uncontrived bodhicitta and then the bodhicitta of action or engagement that follows from that when we have that mind in that more stable way. But the main difference here, of course, is that, as it says here at the bottom, the main difference between these two is that a wishing mind generation isn't sustained by practice of any of the 6 perfections, while an engaging or practical mind generation is sustained by the practice of any one of the 6 perfections. And those of you who have studied the Bodhisattva vows know that the main vows, the 18 that we're trying to refrain from any root downfalls, aren't really structured around the 6 perfections, but all the secondary vows are divided into sections that we'll see later in the handout that pertain to each of the perfections. And then there's a 7th section that pertains to benefiting sentient beings. But these are really what a bodhisattva does. These are the job description of a bodhisattva. You develop this mind of bodhicitta that's aspirational. On the basis of that, you engage in the bodhisattva's deeds. So we will see this subject coming up in chapter 1 in terms of how these minds are distinguished with an example. But I just thought I'd give some background on that. I don't mention the two other ways that we could talk about. Well, actually, we should probably finish on the next page at the top. There's a little bit more on this, and then I'll go on to talk about what I was going to touch on. He says here, even after taking the vow of the engaging mind generation, there are two ways of engaging. So this is after you have taken that vow and moving forward in your practice. First, when even at the time of increasing the intention of giving, there is the active aspiration to achieve omniscient mind. Such a practice is an activity directly sustained by mind generation. So this is when you are cultivating bodhicitta while you are feeding your pets or whatever. I mean, it's important to bring bodhicitta to as many of our actions as possible. If we have that bodhicitta mind while we are engaged in the act of giving, it's directly sustained by that. But we can secondly have an activity during which there's no mind generation manifested. And that's an activity that's not directly sustained by mind generation, but nonetheless you have your mind generation kind of below the surface there. It's just not manifest. So this is probably a delineation that we would only have once we have what I described earlier as uncontrived or spontaneous bodhicitta. So essentially what we do is we cultivate bodhicitta through familiarity and through our deepening of our meditation on it. And so we're going to go into shortly kind of the techniques that you go about doing that. Most of you are familiar with these techniques. I went through them the last time I was here to some degree. But the idea is that you familiarize yourself with bodhicitta in meditation until you get to a place where it arises spontaneously. And you need to have a pretty high level of concentration to do that. It's something that that's one reason why we should engage as continuously as we can every day in some form of stabilizing meditation to kind of try to bring the mind to that more single-pointed nature, because we have to deepen that till we can get bodhicitta or other realizations to be very stable in the mind. This is the whole purpose of stabilizing meditation, is so that we don't have a mind that's kind of all over the place and not capable of focusing directly on any particular meditation topic. When we studied this in the master's program, this same text that I'm citing from here was Jitsumpa, Jetsun Choki Gyaltsen, who writes this. He wrote the textbooks for Sarajay Monastery many, many years ago. Anyway, he says that you have to have a mind that's like the 9th mental abiding that approaches calm abiding. Some of you know this topic of how it's set out in the Lam Rim, how you go through these 9 stages to develop calm abiding, which is the 10th, in a sense. It's the result of all of this. And I think he said at the 9th, possibly the 8th, but most people would need the basis of at least the 9th to make their bodhicitta stable. So we're talking about a pretty highly developed concentration. I'm just putting that out there not to discourage you, but to encourage you, to do your practice, because if you ever want to achieve bodhicitta in this life, you have to have that level of realization. We can have bodhicitta through our actions by cultivating it, making it present in the mind through contriving it in the ways that we're going to talk about. But it's really useful if you have it in your mind to that degree. So the other kind of side topic that isn't in your handout is we mentioned the term conventional bodhicitta. Conventional bodhicitta is most of what we're talking about here in terms of this aspiration and so on. Ultimate bodhicitta is when you combine that mind that is intent upon achieving Buddhahood, that conventional mind, with the realization of emptiness directly. So that we won't be really talking about until we get to the 9th chapter, which is on the perfection of wisdom. But nonetheless, know that you might hear that term sometimes, ultimate bodhicitta. It's not referring to the conventional bodhicitta except as a support for realizing emptiness. So even those practitioners who aren't bodhisattvas, who realize emptiness on the Hinayana path, for example, they realize emptiness and have a direct realization of that topic, but they don't have ultimate bodhicitta because they don't have bodhicitta to begin with. They don't have that motivation. They only have a mind of renunciation that drives them to do that. So that's another topic that, again, we'll maybe touch on at a later point. But I just wanted to mention that because we did use that term, conventional bodhicitta, on the first page, and just want to make sure that you have a kind of understanding of that. So any questions up to this point? Everyone's kind of on board? By the way, we're going to do the break a little bit earlier today because of a situation with some folks here. So we're going to take the lunch break around noon. Okay? Does that work for people? Is that okay? So anyway, we'll continue and may just take like a stretch break maybe in about 15-20 minutes so that people can just get up and stretch a little, and then we'll continue till about noon. Have a little bit longer afternoon. But so let's look at what's on here for the two methods for generating bodhicitta. Like I said, don't want to belabor this, and I didn't have a chance to review this. I actually would have changed a couple of things on here, but nonetheless, there's the sevenfold cause and effect, which is a technique where one first one precedes all of these techniques with the meditation on equanimity, which most of you are familiar with, where we try to get rid of the bias that we have towards friends, enemies, and strangers by our minds of attachment, aversion, and indifference, which is how we don't relate to those beings in a healthy way. We have to have an equal regard for all of them. So it's a meditation where we try to develop that equanimous mind that is holding all of them with that equal regard. On the basis of that, we have the first technique, which is the sevenfold cause and effect method. The first three are really setting the stage for this, which is where you think about the fact that every being has been very close to you. And in that role here, we use the idea of them being your mother, because the mother shows amazing kindness, particularly in this human life when we're quite vulnerable and frail when we're born. We need a mother's attention and love and care, or someone to play that role, for us to continue to be safe and develop and so on. So we then remember the kindness that these beings showed us when they were our mother. And it's not just an idea, oh, maybe they were my mother. It's based on the concept that we have beginningless lives. So every time we've been born in a womb, or from a womb, or from an egg, we've required a mother to play some role in terms of our care and nurturing. So then we remember the kindness they must have shown us. We wish to repay that kindness, and that sets the stage for the two main things that feed into bodhicitta: great love and great compassion. Great love being that sincere wish to be fully dedicated to bringing beings to happiness, culmination of happiness and enlightenment especially, and great compassion that wants to free them from all their suffering, remove everything, all the obscurations and suffering in their mind. So you cultivate those two thoughts in this meditation in a very simple way, and then you go on to develop an altruistic intention to actually do this for others. Even though you've generated those thoughts, you have to be committed to the degree where you think that you will do this even if it's by yourself alone. On the basis of that, you then think, well, but how can I possibly do that? Because in my current state, I'm incapable. Well, the only way is to become a Buddha. So this is the idea behind this technique. I'm sorry I'm going through it quite fast for those of you who may not have exposure to this idea. Most of the texts that are commentaries do go into this to some degree, but I feel like for many of you, is anyone completely new to this idea of bodhicitta and how to develop it? No? Okay. All right. Then let me just go quickly through the other one too. The other one of equalizing and exchanging self and others. Here, the target is this mind of self-centeredness or self-cherishing that we tend to be really caught up in. This is our default mode throughout our days, is to just be very self-centered, focused on me, myself, and I, what I need for my own well-being, and we often neglect the welfare of others. The first step is to equalize self and others, to have that equal ground that we're both standing on, because we see others are exactly the same as us. They want to be happy, don't want to suffer in the same way that we do. Then we contemplate the shortcomings, the disadvantages of continuing to cherish ourselves more than others, not exchanging self and others in the way that we're going to talk about. Then we look at the advantages of doing that exchange, which simply boils down to a wonderful verse we'll see later in this text in chapter 8. Master Shantideva says, all the suffering there is in the world comes from wanting happiness for oneself alone. All the happiness there is in this world comes from wanting happiness for others, being dedicated to their welfare, cherishing them. So these are the simple advantages and disadvantages of those two minds. Then we look at the ability to do that, and we determine we are going to exchange self and others. We go on to engage in Tonglen, this very powerful practice of developing compassion by taking the sufferings of others on oneself. And then the great love that wishes to give what we have to them so that they can become happy. And then from all this, one can come to bodhicitta. We could include one thing I'd change is maybe insert step 6 from the previous method in there. It'd be good to maybe do some meditation on this superior altruistic intention before generating bodhicitta. But at some point, you do have to come to that final state of mind that once more says, yeah, well, I can do this in my meditation and I can practice Tonglen and think I'm removing everyone's suffering. I have to become capable to do that. So both of these techniques derive from great love and great compassion. This is obviously a big emphasis in both of these. And they culminate in the mind of bodhicitta. They can be combined, and there is a technique for doing that. I would have also included that. I, again, should have reviewed this material a little more before today, so I apologize for. But I would include the 11-step method, which is in Pabonka Rinpoche's. And essentially what he does is start with equanimity, then he does the first 3 of the first one, and then he does 1, 2, 3, and then he divides 5 into 2. So that would be 5 there, and ends up with altruistic contention and bodhicitta. So that's another 7. 7 and 4, yeah. 1, 3, and 7. Anyway, if you need that, I can send that along to everyone. So any questions about bodhicitta? This is just because I want to make sure that we're all kind of in the same ballpark in terms of what we're talking about this weekend. Yes, Sneh.
I always go back to this because I just need reinforcement. It's because both of them rest on that level playing field of equanimity and impartiality. And I find like that for me is so difficult.
Having it.
Yeah, just to see, friends of course it's easy, and even neutral is easy. But to see people that you find difficult and have the same affection for everyone and then proceed. So, of course I've heard this before, but I always feel like need reinforcement for all the reasons why it's important to develop that kind of equanimity and impartiality.
Well, again, if we look at this reality, it's a very good question, Sneh. So again, this question of how do we make sure that we include everyone in that scope of equanimity, especially the difficult people. If we look at the fact that these are all just appearances of this life that are karmically conditioned by this life, that we have some kind of karma with beings that causes them to appear as our enemy, to be a difficult person for us. We have karma with others that causes them to appear as friends. One of the main meditations in equanimity is to loosen all that up, to recognize that it is just a karmic appearance of this life, and even just this time of this life. Things can always change. We've seen that in our own lives, right, where we had somebody we were very close to, and then we had a disagreement with them, something happened, and then they became like our worst enemy. We just wanted nothing to do with them. This happened in high school to me. So, like high school is like the breeding ground for that kind of thing. But it's not that it doesn't happen outside of high school, but nonetheless, we know that this is subject to change. But if we start taking into account lifetimes, well then we know that it's revolving all the time. We can be, what was that little story about Master Shantideva seeing this family having a meal and like recognizing that the fish that's being eaten was somebody from this past life and the dog was nibbling on the bones, or whatever, all this very stuff that these beings are like rotating around, and what was one's enemy became, one's parent or whatever, all these various things. We don't know the roles that all these beings have played. So when we make an assessment to hold them in a different regard, to have this bias towards them in this life because they're an enemy, it's not really factual. It's only based on a very limited amount of data. If we take into consideration the bigger picture, which we don't know, obviously, I don't know every being and what they've appeared as in my prior lives. And we don't know the future as well. But if you just give some leeway to that idea and you say, well, beings have had the variety of roles, well then why should I only hold my affection and care for the people who are very close to me and the people who are strangers? I'm limiting those people by not extending to them that same regard. So I think that's one of the, we really do have to meditate on that a lot to really have that hit home. But there are other ways that we can look at the equality of beings. Certainly when we get to equalizing and exchanging self and others, that first step of that meditation, that's very much an equanimity meditation, because it sees that even those enemies, those difficult people, even the political people that we don't care for, are fundamentally the same in their desire to be happy, their desire to not suffer, and yet they still suffer and they still aren't happy. They're still bereft of all of that. So in that way we can see them through that equal regard there as well. But the idea is that we have to be able to reframe things. This is the whole Buddhist teachings, I like to use this word reframe, are all about reframing. All about saying, how can I look at something differently? Not just as like a pie in the sky kind of thing, something that is more accurate actually. Because in the light of countless lives, then it is more accurate to take into consideration the vast quantity of lives rather than only how they're appearing in this life, because that's very specific karma that's happening right now that doesn't have anything to do with what happened in the past. And of course, when we get to that first step of the sevenfold cause and effect, where we're recognizing that all beings have been our mothers, well then every one of these beings has been in that very dear role. That's where we take that equal playing field and we elevate them all to being very precious, very dear. You know, somebody pointed out to me once, well, they've also all been your worst enemy. And I mean, it's true. I mean, but there's not much good in doing that meditation. You know, if I want to think about every being as having been my worst enemy, so I can cultivate more hatred towards them, well, you know, that's using your meditation, you know, in a totally wrong way, right? Because you're just strengthening the delusions. So, I don't know, does that help a little bit?
It helps a lot.
Okay. Good.
It also helps me because I've always wondered, like, why, it's ultimate bodhicitta. Like, why do they use the word bodhicitta for ultimate bodhicitta when it's supposed to refer to realization of emptiness?
Right.
Whereas conventional bodhicitta is more natural. I can understand where they're going at,
Sure.
with that. But I think now when you were just talking, it made me think that, even in the realization of emptiness, like you said, it has to be supported by bodhicitta. Like that's what makes it, gives it the force and makes Mahayana.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why I think, now I'm thinking, and I have to think more, but there's a reason why they didn't just say, oh, it's realization of emptiness. Why they couched it even in the words of bodhicitta.
Right, right. Yeah, I think so, because it's emphasizing that this is a distinct thing for the Bodhisattva to develop. The Hinayana practitioners, what we call the hearers and the solitary realizers, don't achieve that. They achieve a realization of emptiness directly. They have to in order to achieve liberation. But they don't have ultimate bodhicitta because they're lacking that mind, that motivation. So I think that's why it's set up that way, to say that that is what happens with bodhicitta. We have our conventional bodhicitta that gets us along the path so far, and then it becomes the support for ultimate bodhicitta. And it's not that you lose your conventional bodhicitta, but it becomes more powerful by being united with that wisdom realizing emptiness. And that's really where, the whole process of removing all of that starts, and being able to eventually have the force to remove the knowledge obstructions, which are what keep you from becoming a Buddha. We'll talk about those, I think, a little later, but thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, let me just talk a little bit about Master Shantideva so you have a little understanding of him. Some of you have heard of the story of Master Shantideva. He was very similar to the Buddha in terms of being born as a prince in a royal household. He lived from, one source says 687 to 763. I don't know if they have these dates down in fact, but nonetheless, somewhere in that time frame of mostly in the 8th century he lived. And it was, of course, after the time of these other great practitioners, Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti. He was actually around the time when Buddhism had already come to Tibet. This was, I think it was in the 6th century or 7th century when Buddhism first came into Tibet. He had a number of dreams of Manjushri, and decided on the basis of these dreams when he was quite young to enter the monastery of Nalanda. Many of you know of, not Nalanda, the one we have in France, but the original Nalanda monastery that was in India. Nalanda is actually His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he talks about Tibetan Buddhism, he says it's a Nalanda tradition. Don't think of it as Tibetan Buddhism necessarily. We follow Nalanda Monastery and its great masters. And so he was ordained as Shantideva, originally born as Shantivarman, as this prince. He left the royal palace and went to the monastery. And Shantideva, many of you know, it means God of peace. This is what his name means. In secret, he did continue to obtain extensive teachings from Manjushri, who appeared to him. So he was obviously very highly realized even when he went into the monastery already. But outwardly, he gave this appearance of not really doing much. And all the other monks called him 3 discriminations. Because they only discriminated him doing 3 things with his day. He would eat, sleep, and defecate. And so this was kind of his nickname, and he's kind of had a Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer kind of story. He was looked down by all the other monks, and And poor Shantideva, I mean, he was very humble. He didn't, fight back or anything. He just kind of continued to take all this abuse. And so the most famous story about him relates to this text that we're studying. And you might hear different versions of this, but essentially what happened was there would be these regular talks that were given, and the monks decided they would kind of nominate Shantideva to give this talk on a particular day, thinking he would utterly fail and he'd be a disgrace and so on. They were kind of mean-spirited. I can't believe that many Buddhist monks were that mean-spirited. But the idea is that he, went ahead and was prepared to come to give this talk. Well, the monks ahead of time had arranged a really high throne to kind of also make fun of him and what have you, and put this throne so high that he couldn't possibly get up on it. And of course, the higher the throne, you're supposed to be doing that really just for people who have great realizations or whatever, who are higher status. But there were no steps there or anything. And so Shantideva comes into the audience of this, with this throne there. And they said that he kind of magically appeared at the top of the throne. He didn't, no one saw how he got up there or anything. And he began, he first asked the audience, he said, would you like me to teach something that has already been taught before, or would you like me to teach something that is completely new, something they'd never heard before? And they thought, well, we'll really get him now, even though he's appeared on the throne here somehow, we're going to ask for something completely new. He can't possibly come up with something on the spur of the moment that's completely new. So they asked for that, and he began to recite this text. And of course, it was something that he had worked up in his mind, before, obviously, and he recited it. And they say that when he got to a certain part of the 9th chapter, some say it was during verse 34 of the 9th chapter that it is explaining the correct view of emptiness, he began to levitate, and he ascended into space and eventually disappeared altogether. Though the teachings, the voice kind of was still there, completing the entire text, because there's a chapter 10 that's a dedication chapter after this. So it's kind of a bit of a mythical story. After the teaching was completed, those in the congregation who had high powers of memory wrote down all of what Shantideva had taught. They say that you can, through this dharani of retention, you can actually retain all the words that are spoken. It's a deep concentration that you can develop, where this is how the Buddha's teachings continued to be disseminated even before they were written down. Ananda and so on, having that power to be able to remember everything that the Buddha taught. Well, they did the same here with Shantideva. They wrote down all of this. They had questions for him, and so he had left Nalanda for the south of India, and 2 of these panditas went to see him and asked him to return to Nalanda to clarify things in the text, to let him know about the text that he had referred to in the teachings, which is his other text he composed, the Siksa Samuccaya, which is usually translated as the Compendium of Deeds, I think it's called, usually is what it's called. It has been translated into English now. There is an English version of it. I haven't read it, but apparently it goes into more conduct kind of things, but is not quite as eloquent of a text, perhaps, as the one we're studying. So anyway, he didn't return to Nalanda at that time, but he said that that text would be hidden in a roof beam of his monastic cell at Nalanda, and he gave them, permission to go and look at that text. He gave them a transmission of the teachings and so on. And we have this text because of Master Shantideva's kindness and these monks' unkindness. So anyway, that's about it. That's all I want to say on Shantideva, perhaps. All right. So again, this third file is just some handouts that I put together when I taught this in 2006, and I'll just be referring to this occasionally. For this first part of introducing the text and all of that, I want to spend a little more time with that handout, because this gives an overview of the entire text. So there are 10 chapters to this text, as we alluded to in that story of Shantideva. He was, again, the 9th chapter being one of the more profound ones that's studied. There's at the bottom of page 2 of that handout, it begins with chapter 1. Chapter 1 is what we're going to look at first, a detailed explanation of the benefits of developing the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta. This is kind of like back in Buddhist days, what they had as advertising for Buddhism, for bodhicitta. They kind of first give you all the benefits, like if you do this, if you cultivate this mind, you'll have all these amazing benefits. It's going to do all these wonderful things for you. So this is very common in this tradition, to have like the advertising of the benefits at the very beginning. Sometimes they even advertise the disadvantages if you don't, subscribe to that particular mind, but that doesn't really get covered here. Then on the top of page 3, we see the second chapter, which the titles, by the way, are from this version. That's why you might not see them agreeing quite to what's on the Gyaltsab J commentary, but disclosure of evil or confession. This is an explanation of how to prepare the mind for the cultivation of bodhicitta by eliminating all the negativities that impede its development. So we're going to be essentially going into what's a very lengthy 7-limb prayer. You'll be introduced to this concept of the 7-limb prayer there. And the first part of the 7-limb prayer up through confession is in that second chapter, confession being the main part of that chapter, where we have to kind of purify what obstructs our development of bodhicitta. The third chapter that we'll go through this weekend as well, hopefully we'll have time for that, is the full acceptance of the awakening mind, kind of what it looks like to make a commitment to the bodhisattva path. It includes a small part about taking the vows, and again has the rest of the 7-limb practice to start with. So it's a really important chapter. It's not a very long chapter, but gives us that kind of conclusion to these first 3 that are really about how do we come to understand what bodhicitta is, be inspired by seeing its benefits to practice it, how to try to make it very stable in the mind by removing any of these obstacles to it. Chapter 4 gets into conscientiousness, an admonishment to conscientiously maintain one's bodhicitta and prevent it from decreasing. When I taught this as a course in Santa Fe, I taught the first 4 chapters together, but obviously the 4th chapter is very hard to fit in with the 3 on a weekend, so we'll be doing that separately. Chapter 5 is on guarding alertness or introspection, how we guard our behavior. It's essentially the perfection of morality, the second of the 6 perfections. The perfection of generosity, the first one, isn't until the very end at dedication. Patience is the 3rd perfection, the second one presented here in terms of chapter 6, an explanation of how to maintain a mind, that is undisturbed and without anger. Enthusiasm or joyous effort, an explanation of the perseverance that is a delight in virtue. Most of you know these 6 perfections, 6 paramitas. Chapter 8 is a wonderful chapter because it's an explanation of how to develop a mind of calm abiding, perfection of meditation or concentration. But what's interesting in chapter 8 is it also has some instruction on equalizing and exchanging self and others. So it kind of goes back to bodhicitta and pulls that into chapter 8. Really quite nice. His Holiness likes to teach on chapter 8 a lot. Chapter 9 on wisdom, an extensive explanation of the penetrative insight or discriminating wisdom that perfectly realizes the view of emptiness for the bodhisattva. That's usually the 6th perfection, and then, as I said, the 1st perfection comes around at the very end by dedicating the merit of this whole text and our study of it for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And usually I just include that within chapter 9 because it's not a text, or that chapter doesn't require a lot of commentary. It's just dedication verses. So you just recite all these wonderful dedication verses. And of course it has that great verse that His Holiness always refers to and encourages people to bring to mind, which is, for as long as space exists and as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the miseries of the world. That's part of that dedication chapter. So that's kind of an overview of the 10 chapters. There's a summary of the first 9 chapters according to Nagarjuna's prayer on bodhicitta. We do this frequently at the end of our teachings, right? Where we say, may the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. So the first 3 chapters are really the idea of may it rise and grow, that we haven't arisen. So it's to help us to be inspired to cultivate bodhicitta and remove any obstacles to our engaging bodhicitta in particular. And then may that which has arisen not diminish. That's through having that conscientiousness, that guarding alertness and patience, because patience, if we get a mind of anger, then anger diminishes and decreases the power of our bodhicitta. And how does it increase? It increases through enthusiasm, through meditation, through wisdom, and then, of course, we could, have the dedication chapter kind of be the concluding prayer for all of this. But anyway, this is one way that you could talk about these chapters in terms of that wonderful verse that we frequently recite. And then I'm not going to read these, but you can read these. This is a presentation on the 10 chapters according to the commentary I used the last time I taught this, which again, I don't have it in a final version to send to you. I'd have to talk to Ziggy. The FPMT never really published it as this was a special request, I think, that Geshe Jampa Gyatso, my teacher in Italy who taught this, he made that request of Ziggy to translate that text for his use. Because as I said, we didn't have the Gyaltsab commentary translated in the FPMT at that time. So you can look at this and see, maybe I'll just read chapters 1 and 2 and you can read the rest on your own. Chapter 1, in order to initially generate the aspiring mind that aspires to supreme enlightenment by way of this great treatise, through contemplating well its benefits, you need to increase the force of your enthusiasm exceptionally. This is revealed by the first chapter. Chapters 2 and 3, you must uphold the 2 minds of enlightenment by confessing negativities and obscurations, which is the first thing, the adverse conditions for the generation of bodhicitta, and 2, accumulating the 2 collections, the favorable conditions for the generation of the mind of enlightenment. Therefore, these 2 points are respectively taught by the 2nd and 3rd chapters. Okay, so that's essentially it that I want to talk about in regard to introducing this text. Let's get into the text. So my plan for going through this, why you have the other 2 files you've been sent. One has just the root text, translated again by Ziggy, and then the other one has the commentary by Gyaltsab. Why you have both is because, nothing against Venerable Fetter's translation, but I do like Ziggy's and I've used it before, and so I'm going to use that for the root verse, but then we're going to use Gyaltsab for the commentary. So it's a little challenging because we're going to need to have both things in front of you if that's possible, and on your devices it might be a little more difficult. What I did is I actually translated Gyaltsab into these little booklets, so I have like a little chapter 1 booklet that I've gone through and made notes in, and it's a little easier this way, perhaps, if you do print them out. But you do have to have a printer that can do all that, I suppose. I think most of them do. So let's go ahead and begin chapter 1, the explanation of the benefits of the mind of enlightenment, by using Ziggy's translation and reciting first just the praise. Homage to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And let's do the first verse as well. Respectfully, I pay homage to the Sugatas, who are endowed with the Dharmakaya, as well as to their children, and to all who are worthy of homage. Let's stop there, actually, because it's a good place to stop. This is mostly the homage that is in these first 2 lines, as well as the first initial homage. So it's interesting, they say that if you look at the homage for various certain texts, it kind of gives, by virtue of what the homage, who the homage is being paid to, it gives a clue as to what the subject matter of the text is. And so there are 3 main baskets, these 3 baskets of the Buddha's teachings. Essentially, we have the basket of the Vinaya, which are the teachings on morality. And of course, they're mostly for monastics, but nonetheless, anything around behavior. Then we have the basket of the sutra, which sutra is kind of sometimes the name given to the overall set of discourses the Buddha gave. But in this context, the sutra basket refers to the teachings on concentration and other practices that kind of support the development of that. The third of these baskets is the Abhidharma, A-B-H-I, Dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, Abhidharma, which essentially means higher knowledge or manifest knowledge. It's the wisdom teachings of the Buddha, the wisdom basket. And so that basket, there would be a different homage. I think the homage there is usually to like Manjushri and so on. But anyway, when it says homage to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, it's essentially indicating the sutra basket. So this is kind of interesting because, this text contains everything pretty much. It contains some level of, behavioral kind of things, but it also includes teachings on emptiness. So you could say, while it contains a lot of that, because most of it is drawn from the sutra basket, all these other practices together with concentration, essentially that's why it's called a sutra basket teaching and has this homage to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I'll wait for that to go by. So this is just all I want to say about the homage. I don't think there's anything that wonderful about that line, that needs to be indicated. The verse 1:1, and what I often do when we go through these is I'll refer to the first, to each of these 4 lines as A through D. So we have verse 1, AB, lines A, B. We're kind of making an interesting homage with this, that actually in the previous commentary that I'd used by that Abbot Dragpa Gyaltsen, he went into a lot of detail on this. But let's look at what Gyaltsab says in terms of his commentary on this first part. So if you have Gyaltsab's commentary, again, what Venerable Fedor has done, he's given a nice little introduction to each of the chapters usually, though for chapter 1 I don't know that there really is an introduction to the chapter, and then goes into the meaning of the text. Yeah, he has his own little thing from Gyaltsab about what the title means, Bodhisattva Caryāvatāra, Bodhi meaning enlightenment, Sattva meaning brave one or heroic one, Charya meaning action, and Avatara meaning introduction or entrance to. So it's entrance to the brave being of enlightenment, the Bodhisattva, their actions, their deeds. And then there's a translator's prostration, which is this I prostrate to all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So maybe that actually was by the translator. That wasn't something Shantideva put there. And it says there, the purpose of the translator's prostration. This is page 3, by the way, of chapter 1 commentary. Sorry, I didn't give that page earlier. The purpose of the translator's prostration is to pacify the obstacles to the translation and to identify this text as a commentary belonging mainly to the sutra basket of teachings. Although in general it is a commentary on all the baskets of teachings, like I said, right? Okay, so then we get to page 5, and there's outlines for this. And by the way, I've gone and penciled it in the margin of mine, but it's kind of hard to keep track of these outlines because you lose track of where you are, what hierarchy, of all this. So there is a way of doing a hierarchical outline, which is essentially where you start with numbers, and then when you go into a subtopic of that number, you go to letters, and then when you go into a subtopic of that letter, you go to a number again. And it can get quite involved, but nonetheless, I did that because otherwise I lose track of where I'm at. And I was kind of surprised Venerable Fedor didn't put that in his text. Usually they do that to kind of keep you on track somewhat. So essentially what we're in is we're in the third topic now. We had the meaning of the title, the translator's prostration, and now we've got the meaning of the text. And then there will be a conclusion, that will be the fourth topic. But nonetheless, we're going to be in the meaning of the text. The whole time we're pretty much talking about the text. So we first get into the preparatory actions for explaining the stages of the Mahayana path, and there's a homage that is made in the first 2 lines. That's where we're at. And the homage is divided into a purpose, a summary, and the meaning of the words. So I'm not going to say that for all of these necessarily, but at least you get the idea of the structure of this, that it kind of takes you down into deeper and deeper outlines, and then it comes back out to the next outline that's in that next, and so on. It's kind of hard to follow at times, but... So we saw Venerable Fedor's explanation, or commentary, translation of the commentary by Gyaltsab says, by expressing the qualities of special objects and going for refuge, one comes to be understood as a holy being, and the obstacles to the composition of the treatise are pacified. In the end, one attains definite goodness, and other disciples will also follow this example. As a result, they too will achieve all accumulations of goodness. This is just him saying, why do we do these, homages? The purpose is because it clears away obstacles to completing the text and to doing what's needed to be done to finish it, to pacify all those obstacles and so on. So in the end, one attains definite goodness. Definite goodness is one of the 2 results we can say that the Buddha's teachings are all about. The Buddha's teachings can be summarized in terms of the 2 results of high status, which is mostly what the small scope of the Lamrim is about. High status meaning a good rebirth. But then the other 2 results of the Lamrim, liberation and enlightenment, are included in this term here of certain goodness or definite goodness. Definite goodness is called that because unlike high status isn't definite. You can get a good rebirth like what we have here, but if we don't create the causes for another good rebirth, we could plummet from this rebirth into an unfortunate one. That's why the small scope is taught, right? To give people everything they need to attain high status or high rebirth. But that high status isn't definite goodness because it's unreliable. You only have it for as long as it lasts. If you attain liberation or enlightenment, especially enlightenment being the goal here, then you have definite goodness. Why? Because once you attain that state, you never degenerate from that. You will never have any weakening of that state because I wouldn't say liberation is a final state. You attain that liberation, you go on to attain enlightenment beyond that. But nonetheless, either of those are definite to continue to occur. You never degenerate from those. So then a summary in terms of this, he says, Shantideva prostrates to the triple gem and others worthy of homage. This is how we could describe those two lines. Shantideva is prostrating to the three jewels, and then any other beings who are worthy of homage. So how does that play out in terms of a more detailed explanation? The term sugata, we have that in the first line, right? Respectfully, I pay homage to the sugatas. Sugatas are usually translated as those gone to bliss. This sugata has gata, means gone. Remember, you've recited the Heart Sutra, right, with gate, gate, paragate. Gata means to have gone, and then sukha is bliss. And so essentially you've got this gone to bliss. But in terms of sugata, we can say that the gone part of it, in terms of, let me get my notes and make sure I'm giving all this correctly, the kind of, well, actually, yeah, maybe I have to get into the Tibetan a little bit here. Many of you know this word. When we recite the refuge verse in Tibetan, which we didn't do today, but there's this word that it starts with, which is Sangye. Everyone's heard this word, Sangye. Sangye meaning Buddha. Pardon? No, what I hear about it is that Sang has the connotation of completely purifying. Sang means to have gotten rid of all impurities. Gye, on the other hand, means to have fully developed. So it's interesting. I mean, it's not an exact equivalent of sugata, but nonetheless, it's pointing to the reality that we have embedded within this idea. Because sugata, tathagata, victor, conqueror. I mean, there's a lot of different translations or different terminology that are used to refer to a Buddha. All of these are just epitaphs for the Buddha. They're not, there's no difference in terms of what they're signifying. It's just different ways of approaching the Buddha's qualities. And so any of these, when we boil it down to Buddha, of course the Sanskrit word Buddha means to awaken. The Tibetan word they used when it came into the Tibetan language, though, was this Sangye, with both of those connotations. So essentially we have, in terms of a sugata, two different things that are going on. We have the complete abandonment, the complete getting rid of everything that is negative in the mind, and we have the complete realization of everything that is positive, the complete development of all of that. So essentially, we can say that this includes the nature truth body, which is well, let me start with the other one. The realizations is essentially the Dharmakaya, the truth body, and especially the wisdom truth body, the Jnana Dharmakaya. This is the final resultant state of having developed your mind to the degree of Buddhahood. That Dharmakaya, that mind, has an emptiness. Every phenomenon has an emptiness, meaning that there is a lack of inherent existence of that phenomenon. So the emptiness of the mind of a Buddha is its nature truth body. But that nature truth body then, it's pure, free from any stains of inherent existence, but it's also free at this point of attainment from everything else that defiles the mind. That's why it's sang, it's completely purified. Sang means to have removed everything that in any way defiles the mind. All of the obscurations to liberation as well as the obscurations to omniscience. Gye means to fully develop. So in the full development, we have the Dharmakaya, the wisdom truth body, because that's the fully developed mind of a Buddha. But together with it, we have the nature truth body. The nature truth body essentially being, it's the svavavika kaya, I think is how it's usually spelled out. Make sure that I've got that correct. Anyway, these two are kind of being indicated by this term sugata. So essentially that's what we mean by a Buddha jewel, is at the deepest level, that fully realized mind and the emptiness of that mind. But by virtue of having that, I mean, if that was all that a Buddha's experience was, you couldn't relate to a Buddha, right? Because it would just be this pure mind that is empty of all defilements. We need what are called the form bodies, the rupakaya. So we have dharmakaya, which is divided into these two, the wisdom truth body and the nature truth body. But then we have the rupakaya, which are the two ways that Buddhas appear through the force of their compassion to benefit others. And so any being who possesses dharmakaya, who possesses those two aspects of the completely enlightened mind, fully developed mind, and the fully purified state, those beings all automatically have an enjoyment body, what's called sambhogakaya. You don't have to know all of these details, but essentially I'm just giving you some background to why this is such an incredible praise, is because it's including all aspects of a Buddha. Because just by saying Sugata, you mean someone who's gone to the bliss of Buddhahood, they've achieved Sangye, they've achieved complete purification, achieved complete development of qualities. By virtue of that, they appear in various forms. One of the forms is this enjoyment body, the Sambhogakaya, which appears in a very pure realm to only high-level bodhisattvas and so on. But then they have what are called emanation bodies, or nirmanakaya, which essentially are the ways that Buddhists help us. In this tradition we talk about our gurus being Buddhas. Well, then they are nirmanakaya. They are emanations of an enlightened mind appearing in physical form to aid us on our path. So, that's the reason for this whole explanation that's going to be coming up here in terms of excellent abandonment and excellent realization. That's on the bottom of page 5 to the top of page 6. So let's go through that and then see if there are questions on that. So the term Sugata can be related to both of these, to Sang, complete abandonment, and to Gye, complete realization. The qualities of excellent abandonment are similar to a person possessing a good body. If one has exhaustively abandoned the afflictive obscurations, then one has gone to the good or the beautiful. Similar to having completely purified a contagious disease, one has gone beyond falling into psychic existence through the power of the afflictions. Similarly to a well-filled vase, having gone to all and thus having gone to bliss, which is again what Sugata literally means, through having exhaustively abandoned the non-afflictive ignorance. So this is essentially saying that we have kind of gone to what is good and beautiful through abandoning the afflictive obscurations, no longer being bound up in samsara, but we have also abandoned the non-afflictive ignorance, which is essentially the knowledge obscurations. There are two obscurations that the Bodhisattva abandons to become a Buddha. If you were to only abandon the afflictive obscurations, you would be the same as a person who's finished the Hinayana path. But for you to go on to abandon then the knowledge obscurations is what makes Bodhisattvas unique, is that they want to become omniscient. They want to develop that complete knowledge. So this is essentially what's being referred to here in terms of their excellent abandonment. They haven't just abandoned the afflictive obscurations nor samsara that is based on those, but they've gone on in that third bullet point to go completely to bliss by getting rid of these knowledge obscurations. So again, the difference between those two is that the afflictive obscurations are what's rooted in our ignorance that believes that things inherently exist. We're not going to go into deep teachings on emptiness this weekend because it's not the main topic of this initial part of the text. But there is an imprint that we've had on our minds from having that ignorance since beginningless time that causes things to appear to inherently exist, appear to exist on their own. So the imprints that cause that and that false dualistic appearance are what we mean by the knowledge obstructions. They're subtler. The people who only abandon the afflictive obscurations still have this appearance of things existing on their own, but of course they don't believe in it. They don't have any ignorance present that adheres to that. But nonetheless, they still have that false appearance. The bodhisattvas will go on to abandon that, and when you achieve Buddhahood, you have to have completely abandoned not just the afflictive obscurations that you do on the first part of the path of seeing and then the path of meditation, but then you go on the last part of the path of meditation to abandon the knowledge obscurations. Here it's being referred to as the non-afflictive ignorance. It's technically not ignorance, but it's the imprints of that ignorance that have been in your mind that are still remaining even after you've removed that ignorance. And that gives the rise to this fictitious appearance. So bliss here, as it says, is referred to as good, And gone means to have become the living example for that. So gone means that you are in that state of being what is perfectly good. The three distinguish respectively from a non-Buddhist that is free from attachment, from a stream enter or a returner and so forth, and from a Hinayana arhat. So these bullet points that we looked at, they distinguish you from a non-Buddhist that's free from attachment. That wouldn't be somebody who's technically free completely from attachment, but nonetheless you can practice deep levels of concentration that allow you to be separated from attachment in a manifest way. It's still there in a dormant way, but you would not be exhibiting any of these afflictions. The second bullet point distinguishes you, the Bodhisattva, the Buddhas, from a stream enter or a returner and so forth. These are various results that are leading up to attaining arhat, but you haven't yet attained it. So by saying that they've actually are no longer in psychic existence, well, these beings are a stream enter and a once returner and a non-returner. They are still caught up in samsara. The third bullet point distinguishes the Buddha from a Hinayana arhat, because as I said, the arhats don't go to that length of removing the knowledge obscurations. Sorry, this is such a wordy explanation of this, but again, don't panic on all this. This is just the introductory kind of praise, and this isn't the main topic that we're going to be looking at. We go on to some really nice, rich, delightful, poetic stuff. This is just to give a background of why this praise is so wonderful that Shantideva gives, because it essentially is praising, by virtue of this, all of the Buddhas. Now, according to excellent realization, that other aspect of Sugata on the top of page 6, it says, having gone to bliss because of directly understanding the suchness of the two selflessnesses, having stable understanding and understanding all. These distinguish as well, respectively, from the three kinds of persons. So these are what distinguish you, again, from the three vehicles, the hearers, the solitary realizers, and the bodhisattvas, is that the being who is a Buddha hasn't just achieved some level of realization, they've achieved all realization. They've understood and developed a stable understanding of all, everything. There's nothing more for a Buddha to attain. Remember that when you achieve that, you've achieved what's called the path of no more learning, the fifth of these 5 paths. So essentially, this is the realization of a Buddha surpasses the realizations of a simple hearer, a solitary realizer, a bodhisattva, even the arhats and so on, because it is the understanding of everything that exists, that omniscient mind. So the final statement on this first part about Sugata is these words: show the praise to the Buddha jewel. So we go back to our explanation in the beginning. It said that this was simply a Shantideva paying homage, prostrating to the triple gem. Well, the first jewel is being paid homage to by virtue of, actually I need to make sure I've got all these texts in front of me here, by that first line, respectfully I pay homage to the Sugatas, period, right there. That's the first jewel. The Dharmakaya, then it says, is the naturally pure sphere, free from all stains, which is the Dharma jewel. And those possessing it are the ones gone to bliss. So essentially, by the Dharmakaya, we mean that, again, that Dharma jewel that they possess, which the Dharma jewel itself can be divided into the Dharma jewel of Scripture and the Dharma jewel of realization. Most of you have heard this before, I think. The Dharma jewel of Scripture is referring to the text. It's what we're studying here. Any text that we look at or teachings we receive is the Dharma jewel of Scripture. But the whole point of Dharma jewel of Scripture is to develop the Dharma jewel of realization, right? Because otherwise, if we just have all of these teachings that we never develop any deep insight into, we haven't really done that necessary work. So essentially, what we're talking about here, when we say in that last part of the first line, who are endowed with the Dharmakaya, we're referring by virtue of that to the Dharma jewel, because it's the realization of the Dharma in the mind of the Sugatas. The Sugatas who have fully realized all Dharma by virtue of their wisdom truth body, their Dharmakaya, which again has its companion of the nature truth body. They therefore have that complete development of that wisdom. Therefore, they are the embodiment of the Dharma jewel. And then it says these two terms then, the Sugatas and the Dharmakaya, as I mentioned earlier, also contain the two form bodies of a Buddha. And we could say the second term, the Dharmakaya, also represents the truth of cessation and the truth of the path of a bodhisattva, which is another way of classifying the Dharma jewel, is in terms of what we mean by a Dharma jewel, is also the cessation of suffering and the delusions that cause it, the obscurations that cause our unenlightened existence, and then the truth of the path, the realizations in the mind of a bodhisattva that lead to that. So then he says, hence, all Buddha jewels and Mahayana Dharma jewels are the object of prostration. So he's saying essentially by this first line, at the beginning we included the Buddhas, the Buddha jewel, but then by including the Dharmakaya, we are by virtue of that including the Dharma jewel. So the Buddhas themselves represent the Buddha jewel as well as the Dharma jewel by the realizations they contain. Children, which is in the next line, right, as well as to their children, that refers to the bodhisattvas, superior bodhisattvas in particular, those who have a realization of emptiness directly. Superior, the word superior is usually in Sanskrit, it's Arya, this word Arya. Arya simply means those who have gone to that special insight, that have developed that insight into emptiness, that are superior in that way. And he says, with their inclusion, the triple gem is complete. Why? Because they are essentially the third jewel, the jewel of Sangha. So let's review really quickly. The Buddha jewel is indicated by the word Sugata, that includes the Sugata of abandonment and the Sugata of realization, which is essentially then says that you have both the realization, which is the wisdom truth body, the wisdom Dharmakaya, and the nature Dharmakaya, the nature truth body, which is the abandonment, the complete purity of that mind, of all of the stains of the afflictions, but also, of course, it's free of any natural stains because it's always been free of natural stains. This is what we mean by the first of the three jewels. The Dharma jewel is implicit by virtue of including this Dharmakaya because it's the full realization of all of the scriptures, and it's also implicitly then the cessation of everything that is obscuring the mind and the paths that have been developed by the bodhisattva that culminate in Buddhahood. All of that realization. And then the third jewel, the Sangha jewel, is implicit by virtue of including the children, the bodhisattvas, because a Mahayana Sangha are the superior bodhisattvas. And when we talk about Sangha in general, we can say that it includes any being who has realized emptiness directly. That's what we mean by the ultimate Sangha jewel. But nonetheless, at least in this context, we want to focus in on what is it that supports our Mahayana path. It's bodhisattva Aryas, those who have superior realizations who then become the Sangha jewel for us. And then he says at the very end of this, Shantideva prostrates respectfully with body, speech, and mind to them and to all others worthy of prostration, such as abbots, preceptors, and so forth. So that was the last part of this line. Trust me, I'm not going to be doing this level of commentary on every one of these lines, or we're never going to get done with any of it this weekend. But this is an important thing because it does go into kind of a whole understanding of what the result is. I mean, we're talking about bodhicitta, developing the mind that's intent upon achieving this result. Well, what does that result look like? That result is this state of sugata, this state of having gone to bliss that is the culmination of all of this complete abandonment, complete realization. Any comments or questions on that? Sorry if I didn't keep things clear. Is it a little... Ellen, do you have a question? Richard, okay. Sorry.
I just had a question having to do with some of the wording here, which is in the root text translation, it says, respectfully I pay homage to the Sugatas who were endowed with the Dharmakaya, but in the other translation it says possessed, I think, with the Dharmakaya.
Possessing the Dharmakaya. Yeah.
The question I have is that it's my understanding that we all possess the Dharmakaya. We just haven't cleared away all the layers of obscurations. And I'm just wondering whether or not something different than that is meant, or whether or not I misunderstand the concept of the Dharmakaya.
I would probably not agree with the statement that we all possess it. We possess the raw stuff from which the Dharmakaya is formed, Buddha potential. So this is, again, maybe a teaching that goes a little off of what we're doing here, but when we talk about Buddha nature, which I mentioned in the motivation today, right, that we all have Buddha nature, we can say there are two components to our Buddha nature, each of which develop into these two components of the Sugata, of the Dharmakaya. So let's talk about those briefly. First, we have a mind that can change, that can develop. So they often call that our developmental bodhicitta. When it gets activated by great compassion and by our desire to move in this direction, the mind can develop all the way to the wisdom truth body, the wisdom Dharmakaya, which is the full culmination of all those realizations, of all of the accumulation of all these great qualities. All right? So that's one aspect of our Buddha nature. So we wouldn't say we have this already. We have the potential in terms of just possessing a mind. You have the ability to develop that mind to Buddhahood, given the right conditions and so on. The other aspect of our Buddha nature is what's called the naturally abiding Buddha nature, or Buddha lineage. This is the emptiness of the mind. The emptiness of the mind is always there as long as there is mind there. Remember when we recite the Heart Sutra, we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form. This is just meaning that you can't have one without the other. We have a mind that can develop into the state of the wisdom truth body. We have the emptiness of the mind that is essentially what we mean by the nature truth body, is that it is fundamentally empty or free of any stains of inherent existence. The nature Dharmakaya or nature truth body of the Buddhas is no different than ours. It has additionally this adventitious purity, they would call it, or purity of adventitious stains, because the Buddhas have completely removed all the other stains in the mind that we haven't yet. So we have a naturally abiding lineage, meaning our minds are empty of inherent existence. They never had any stains of any inherent existence. But we still are together with all the stains of the delusions and the afflictions and so on, all the obscurations. So we are still stained in terms of our minds, but we haven't achieved that full purity that is the nature truth body. Just as we've got a mind that is, but has the potential to develop into Buddhahood, but we haven't done the work to develop it into Buddhahood. So we have kind of the root stuff or the core stuff that both of those bodies can arise from. The Dharmakaya, that's the wisdom truth body, the Dharmakaya that is the nature truth body. But we don't have them in their fully qualified state because we haven't achieved all the realizations, all the wisdom and understanding qualities that are in the wisdom truth body. We also haven't completely removed everything I haven't removed anything. I haven't removed a thing. Anyway, we haven't removed all of what a Buddha removes, all the obscurations. So when we talk about the nature truth body, we can divide it into those two elements of purity. That there's a natural purity, which is its freedom from any inherent existence at all. There are no stains of inherent existence. They never existed. This is something we've been overlaying on things through our ignorance. But then there is the achievement of the purity that is the adventitious stains having been removed, which is the work that you do on the Bodhisattva path that actually allows you to achieve Buddhahood by removing everything that obscures you. And those are, again, the afflictive obscurations and the knowledge obscurations, or obscurations to omniscience, that I was kind of talking about a little bit earlier. Yes. Your question, Ellen.
Yeah,
okay.
That's where my question was going to go, so it's perfect. Because I was jotting this down, and I'm not going to get deep into this, but a very recent conversation with an amazing kid. She's 14, but she's like smart about computers. And we had this conversation about an emptiness machine would enter, and I was like, you would leave behind all your essentially your body, the things that come from being human, essentially. And I was like, this gave me a sense of like what getting rid of afflictive, because that seems tied to. Anyway, it helped me with that piece. But the knowledge obscurations, I feel, are still
a little.
so
Okay. Sure. So again, whenever we have any object that appears to us, like this book, we have, first of all, the main thing that we want to get rid of initially, that's our afflictive obscuration, is that we have a concept. We think this book exists intrinsically, inherently, from the side of what I'm holding in my hand. it seems to have its bookness established, all kind of covering the entire thing, right? I mean, it's a subtle appearance, but it's an appearance that we have all the time. But we're thinking that it exists that way, and in the meantime, it's also appearing to exist that way. Well, these are two different things that are going on. They're quite related. We have the conception, certainly based on the appearance. The appearance reinforces this. But where does the appearance come from? The appearance comes from these imprints in our minds that give rise to this, so that we then agree to that, we assent to that, we keep cultivating more ignorance. So ignorance and appearance are kind of hand in glove. You know, we never can be you can be without the conception eventually, because we can overcome the conception that it's real and true and existing on its own out here. But then we're still going to have this false appearance. And that false appearance eventually is gotten rid of on the Bodhisattva path later on. That's the knowledge obscuration. So, I mean, sometimes I use the example of a dream. When we have a dream, we have things appearing to us that appear to be real in the dream, right? And if we don't have any lucidity in our dreaming, we're going to buy into that reality. We're going to kind of think that those dream objects are real because they appear to be real. You know, they appear as real as objects that are ordinary. Like they might do weird things and have like a strange logic to them in our dream state. But nonetheless, we buy into that appearance of them as real. But if you're lucidly dreaming, you won't have the conception that they're real, but they'll still appear to be real. You're going to still keep having dream objects that seem like, oh, there's a horse over there, and oh, there's this over there, and whatever. And we won't have any of the emotions that you might have in your dream if you're buying into them, but you would still have that appearance even if you're lucidly dreaming. It's similar for the people who have removed the afflictive obscurations but haven't yet removed the knowledge obscurations. They don't have any conviction in what's appearing to them as being real from its own side, established out here, but they still have this false appearance. This false appearance is what the Bodhisattva is intent upon removing, because this is what keeps you from becoming a Buddha. It's the subtlest imprint that causes that dualistic separation of something out there that seems to be established on its own, and you as a subjective awareness of that. And so that dualistic mind that is false, actually, because it has no inherent existence. Because we've proven it has no inherent existence in our reasoning on emptiness, that if you've engaged in all of that and removed the afflictive obscurations, you know that things don't exist this way, but they still appear that way. Just like the lucid dreamer knows that those dream objects aren't real in the way that that waking reality is real, but they still appear to be real. I don't know if that makes sense. That's one way I try to explain them. That's probably the closest thing to... Or even a mirage. I mean, we know that a mirage, after seeing a mirage one time in the desert, you know that it's not real water. But it still appears to be a real water, right? It still has that flickering and looks like it's a pool of water out there on the road or the desert. So we have false appearances, and the false appearances are a product of these imprints from having ignorance since beginningless time. These are what the Bodhisattva is intent upon removing. So, wow, got into a lot more explanation of this than I thought I would, but it's a tough little section to begin with, but like I said, trust that it gets easier after this. So, can we move on? Are we ready to do a little more? Okay. Did you have another question, Richard, or no? Oh, you're good. Everything's good? Okay. All right, let's go on then to the last two lines of verse 1. Here I shall describe how to engage in the vows of the Sugata's children, the meaning of which I have summarized in accordance with the scriptures. So this is the next section, which is a pledge of composition, as in Gyaltsab Je's commentary, page 6 of this first chapter. He divides this into a couple of parts. The first one, identifying the subject. So it says there, this is a compendium that contains all the stages of the path to enlightenment, which cause one to achieve that, such as the practice of the perfections of generosity and so forth, that were engaged in by the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas upon initially generating the mind of enlightenment. A scholar in a commentary relates it only to vows alone, but this is not the meaning of the word here. So this word that we translated, or was translated by Ziggy as vows, here Venerable Fedor translates it as discipline, which is probably a bit more in line with it. he's not talking about just a commentary on the vows, because that's not really even what he gets into in this text. It's technically on the discipline, the behavior, the deeds. This is an introduction to the deeds of the Tathagata's children, the bodhisattvas. And he's going to formulate those for us. So essentially it does contain the entire path to enlightenment, because it's the main practices of a bodhisattva that will have, are supported on all the other stages of the path teachings. So then this idea, that somebody could ask the question, well, have you not made this up yourself? Who is supposed to believe this? Maybe the monks in the audience were questioning him at that level. Shantideva says, there's no fault of self-creation. This introduction to all the stages of the Mahayana path is according to the explanations of the scriptural teachings of the Buddha. This is essentially what he's saying in the second line. I shall formulate in brief according to the teachings, or in ours it said, the meaning of which I have summarized in accordance with the scriptures. He's not making this up, he's taking this from the scriptures. And he's simply just giving that as his own way of asserting the reliability of these teachings. Then someone might further ask on the next page, page 7 of Gyaltsab-je, he says, the question is, yes, one generates realizations in dependence on the scriptures, but to what end compose this text? Why do you need to compose the text if the scriptures are already there? Right? And someone might ask that. Is there some utility to you putting all these teachings together based on the scriptures? Shantideva is being given these words by Gyaltsab-je. He said, there is not fault of repetition, because I explain the teachings in a condensed way so that the meaning of the scriptures can be easily realized. This is what we're used to in a lot of this tradition, right? What is the Lam Rim but a condensation of the essential teachings of the Buddha for us to be able to practice and study them? So this is Shantideva saying, what I have done is, yes, I've relied upon the scriptures, so it's completely reliable, but moreover, there's usefulness to what's being given here, because I'm going to put it in a very easy to practice way. I'm going to, give you everything that you need to know in this condensed manner. So there's no fault of repetition. I'm not doing exactly what the Buddha did. I'm not just repeating all the scriptures. I'm giving you a different way of looking at it. So then finally we get to the last part of this, where we are identifying the purpose, the essential purpose and the relation. So the Mahayana path and its result are the subject. So to understand them in dependence on this treatise is the purpose. To ultimately attain enlightenment in dependence on this is the essential purpose. And that the later does not come about without the earlier is the relation. The purpose of making the pledge of composition is to bring what has been pledged to completion. So there's two things being said here. That whole long first sentence in this commentary gives us 4 features of this text. 1, the subject. The Mahayana path and its results are the subject. And these are actually usually set out for any of these longer treatises and texts. Number 2, what is its purpose? Kind of its more immediate purpose. The more immediate purpose is to understand the path and its result in dependence on what's being set out here. But what is the more essential purpose? What's the greater purpose? Because there's an immediate purpose, which is, this book is here so I can understand the deeds of a bodhisattva and so on. But then why do I need to understand the deeds of a bodhisattva? What's the essential purpose? To ultimately attain enlightenment and dependence upon that is the essential purpose. That's the third of these features. And what's the relationship? There has to be a relationship between the essential purpose and the purpose, because otherwise the text isn't fulfilling the ultimate or essential purpose. So it says that the latter does not come about without the earlier is the relation, right? You cannot achieve ultimate enlightenment without understanding the deeds of the bodhisattva, without being able to know the discipline, the actions that the bodhisattva engages in, that are the explanation of the subject matter, the Mahayana paths, and so on. So this is a very kind of classic way that these sorts of things are set out, with these 4 things of subject, purpose, essential purpose, and then the relationship between these. Then he goes on in the last sentence to say, and the purpose of making the pledge of composition, which is what he's doing in these 2 lines, is to bring what has been pledged to completion. So let's go on to do, maybe we can, I don't know if we can finish this verse. I'm trying to get to the main part of the text, but let's read verse 2 together and we'll start this and then we'll break for lunch. There is nothing here that has not appeared in the past, and I have no skill in the art of rhetoric. Therefore, not to enact the welfare of others, I compose this in order to acquaint it to my mind. So he's just saying, he has no great abilities or anything. He's being very modest, being very humble in regard to this, because the text is amazing. It's beautiful text. But he's saying that he's doing this mostly not out of a self-centered mind, but because he sees how much he needs to work on his own mind. He sees the faults he has in his own mind and wants to develop greater realization. So he's spelling out all of this so he can learn it, so he can practice it. I can think that way in regard to all my teachings. I don't have any realizations, but I love to teach because it helps me to articulate things. And I try to do it for others as well. But Shantideva is being extremely humble here and saying, there's nothing here that you haven't seen before. There's no great skill in rhetoric, no great speaking skill or poetic skill. But it's really not my main purpose to enact the welfare of others by saying this. It's really just to acquaint my own mind with it. But he's not, by virtue of that, disavowing any kind of compassionate motivation. He's just simply being humble, saying, I don't put on airs to think I can possibly benefit others through what I'm doing. Does it make sense? You kind of get the point of that. So when we come back after lunch, maybe we'll go ahead then and take a look at the commentary on that and go through that. Yeah, there's a lot of words in this beginning part, but once we kind of get into the presentation for how we take the essence of this life and so on, this kind of starts to sail a little bit more. So I'm hopeful that we'll get through a bit more, but let's have just a few thoughts of dedication before we leave for lunch. It's always good to dedicate at the end of a session, just to make sure that we sort of seal the positive energy that we've created. So think back over the last 2 hours and all of the thoughts that you've had around this topic of bodhicitta, on how we are approaching this with the text, even this initial homage, how we need to rely upon the 3 jewels in order to accomplish this goal of enlightenment. All of these thoughts, all these words, all the words we've said or heard, that we've read, may all of this become the cause for our enlightenment so we can lead others to that same state. Okay, good. So, 1:30 then, we'll return.